This episode is brought to you by Midwest Night Watchers, found everywhere on your favorite podcast platforms.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Piercing the Veil Thursday edition.
Yeah, and we're back again.
Yeah. What's it been? 3 or 4 times this week already?
Yeah, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
And
Well, for you, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Yeah. So I don't know. It seemed like one day's running into the next. But anyway, welcome. And we are going to be talking about Tartarian and the Chicago World's Fair and a little bit of Chicago history and whether it makes sense, doesn't make sense on how Chicago developed or how fast it exploded. So you guys in chat, help us out. Let us know what you think and or leave a comment after the show if you'd like to, and tell us what you think of the information we're provided. And we have a special guest. You may have seen his videos on TikTok and all over social media as JTFollowsJC. And this is kind of his wheelhouse where he talks about old civilizations and things that just make you wonder and go, I don't know about that. So who all do we have in the house already?
Pardon me? I just said use your common sense.
Oh, yeah. So I was just saying, who do we have popping in the chat already? I just wanted to say hi to everybody. And we got Val and Jason H. And who do you see? I see Gary.
Patty. I see Newbie, Patty, Gary, Robin M. Oh, welcome in, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And if you guys are out there watching us or watching later, make sure you leave us a comment, a like, and a share if you can, and we'd appreciate it. And don't be afraid to come in and chat with us. If you're just popping in, come in and hang out. And the water is warm and everybody's friendly. So come and hang out with us. So like I said, we're going to be talking about the Chicago Columbian Expo, which is, since we live in Illinois, it's kind of a fascinating subject for us. And, you know, we're like, what, three hours outside of Chicago?
Yep, so it takes about 3 hours.
And I think, I'm not 100% positive, but I think some of my relatives actually went to the Chicago Fair because we have some memorabilia in the family from the Chicago Fair. And I actually have a book that they sold at the Chicago Fair about the history of Chicago and Illinois. And it has a lot of pictures of the fair in it and stuff. So it's really interesting. So it might have been printed after the fair, but it was definitely from the Columbian Chicago Fair. So I got those pictures that I can bring up and we can talk about it later. And I think we should just go ahead and bring JT up and we'll get started. Hi, JT. Welcome.
Yeah, welcome, JT.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, like I was saying, I've seen you, and I think you may be new to Jane. I'm not positive, but we watched you on TikTok, and we tend to gravitate towards Tartarian and giants and
Old
mud
world.
floods and all that stuff that goes along with it. And that's why I like your videos a lot, even though you do talk about other stuff along with it. But why don't you introduce yourself to our audience and where they can find you or what you got going on?
Yeah. So my initials are JT, and that's kind of how I go on the internet. And I make videos on TikTok. I make videos, well, for now, I guess, before but I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Rumble, YouTube as well. And, you can find me on Spotify or Apple. And, I talk about the old world. I talk about megaliths, giants, angels, demons. I started making content about 3 years ago, and it kind of centered around obviously a biblical view. So JT follows JC, Jesus Christ. So that's kind of like, so I have this one truth, and everything else I've kind of been like pulling at the sweater of like, wait, we were lied to you about that. So what about this? And that's kind of how my channel is centered. But yeah, I'm like everybody else. I'm just a normal guy, and people get to experience my journey for like what's true and what's false and what, going down different rabbit holes. And that's, and I've spent a lot of time recently going down like the old world rabbit hole, the Tartarian rabbit hole, if you will, like mud flood, all that stuff. And I find history way more interesting when I learn it for myself and not when I was in school.
Right.
Well,
there's not many classrooms that's going to tell you the stuff that we find or the rabbit holes we go down, whether, like I was talking to you previously, like how fast Chicago developed. It seems like overnight. I mean, I know it was like within 50 years, 30 years, they try to tell us that we go from these buggies and wagons and wooden houses or sometimes shacks to skyscrapers and these glorious buildings that we see. So it's like, no, that doesn't add up to us.
Yeah, you're not the only one. It's funny because I've made a few videos, especially like on like the, because I typically take parts of the podcast or live streams I'm on, I turn them into shorter videos for like the social media apps. And one of my videos that's been really popular lately was I just saying, I don't believe the history we're taught. And you get so many people get upset when you say that. And I'm saying, I don't believe the timelines. It's too short. As somebody actually whose day job is I own a commercial construction company with my family. So like I have an idea about building, and I'm just like, there's just no way, like the ornate things that you see in these pictures, the cathedrals and Greco-Roman buildings all around the whole country. And I think what I've noticed a lot is the people who really want to defend the narrative do not know it. And I think that's probably where a lot of us was like that. I liked watching like old Westerns and stuff. And, you have this idea of like what the Wild West was like. And I know that Chicago's not the Wild West, but I mean, it's certainly like on the same kind of timeline as most of the kind of the Western expansion timeline. So when you see like movies like Tombstone, you just have this idea of, okay, that's what it was. It was like cowboys and Indians. It was like storefront looking buildings, all wood and dirt and cussing and shooting and card playing. But if you look at like the movie Tombstone, I think the shootout in the OK Corral was like 1889 or something like that. It was something in the 1880s. So if you just hopped right over to San Francisco at that same time and you look at the pictures of it, it looks like San Francisco today. And you could have never convinced me that back then. I had no idea. And San Francisco is not alone. Yeah, because you could go right to Chicago. You could go to you could go to St. Louis. You go all these cities that are like renowned in America, and they're all fully built out at that time. And I didn't know that. And so when I started to look at the timelines of these cities, I was like, wait, what? So everybody has heard of like the 49ers, like that's where the football team comes from. And so that comes from the idea of like there was this gold rush out west. And then so everybody rushed out there. And then so like a city like San Francisco, I believe they say in 1848, there was like 1,000 people or less. And then so there's a real famous panoramic shot of San Francisco in like the 1870s, like the early 1870s, like 1873, I think. And it's completely built out. 100% of the city is built out. There's cathedrals, there's stone buildings, brick, everything. And there's not one set of scaffolding. There's not one bit of construction happening. And the whole city actually looks like it's got age to it.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I said, you cannot convince me that somebody built a city like San Francisco in 20 years. No, I can't believe that.
Let alone the cathedrals.
Right. It makes no sense.
And then you go, we're supposedly like we were talking about, you're in horse and wagon, that the settlers are going across to the west, to the west coast. So all these major cities are building these skyscrapers, cathedrals out of these great big granite or limestone blocks. Well, who's providing these? What quarry in the U.S. or where are these coming from? Let alone the exotic woods that you see in like the Pullman houses in Chicago or the big houses in San Francisco. Where's all this coming from? Let alone having to get it there by horse and wagon. And like you said, the population of these cities weren't huge enough to support such a workforce to build all this stuff.
Yeah, no way. Well, that's the thing. It's like, so in being in construction, it's like even currently we'd have times where they have allocation for like materials and you can't get all the materials you need. So you can only imagine before they were mass producing materials. Like, I mean, they didn't have drywall back in those days.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have like easy kind of cheap things to make like that. They had to either make it out of wood and brick, steel. I mean, I guess they would have had to use. Yeah, I don't even know how it would have worked. And it's not to mention that it's tough to work in the wintertime now. But back in them days, like they're working through the winter. I mean, like the way they showed some of the timelines, it's like they would have had to been working 24/7, 365 in order to complete things. But we know, obviously, you guys, I don't have to tell you, the Chicago winter is pretty tough. You can imagine them trying to work through winter and building things.
Right.
I don't think it would happen.
And they call it Windy City.
Yeah, it's really cold off that lake.
Well, the Windy City is actually because of the politicians, but people usually think it's the wind off of the Great Lakes or Lake Michigan. But I guess both apply. But but I was looking at a video the other day about the building of the Bears Stadium.
I think I saw something recently about that too.
All the material and all the stuff that they would have had to brought in at the time would have been horse and buggy again, or around that era. I mean, they might have had some trucks, but all the material, and they estimated like 1,000 years if they had all the horses and if they had everything right there that they could get their hands on, it would still take over 200 years to build that stadium on time with all the materials that they put into it. I think I'm quoting that right. I could be wrong, but.
Well, I remember, so I've been to Chicago. Well, I mean, I've been to the airport quite a few times, but I've been to Chicago like one time. And, I'm a guy from the East Coast. I'm from Virginia, and I'm not like, I'm kind of like in a place that's more like the burbs. And so I've been to some big cities, but when I went to Chicago, I remember being really struck by like how big everything was. And I think we were driving by the highway where you could see Soldier Field. And I was really kind of like, whoa, it doesn't look like I pictured it to look. But yeah, like with like the Greco-Roman columns in that place. And you're like, yeah, it's like, it looks really cool. But I'm like, yeah, it just seems like they built that to be a football stadium. Because I was a Redskin fan. I guess they're the Commanders now. And I've been to RFK. That's the stadium they used to have. And then now they built that big monstrosity in Maryland called FedEx Field or whatever it's called now. And so like, obviously that's like a modern stadium. And then you see like what they built in Chicago. And it's like, that doesn't look like a football stadium. And I think there was a similar video, like as you're talking about Yankee Stadium, the original Yankee Stadium.
Yeah.
Similar thing where you're just like, yeah, those things were really cool. Like stadiums don't look like that anymore. It's almost like they repurposed something else and they created a stadium out of it.
Yep. Mm-hmm. I went down the rabbit hole for Soldier Field, Chicago, and I found pictures where they're supposedly building the thing, but like you said, there's no scaffolding, no nothing but those columns in every picture, even though most of the stadium wasn't there. Those columns were fully built in there in every picture. They didn't show anybody making the columns or there was a field without the columns. It's those columns have always been there. So it makes me wonder, was that an arena already, like a Roman arena or some kind of museum like that from the old world, and they just repurposed it? Or
Yeah, I mean, I'm starting to think so. I'm starting to wonder if the Greco-Roman buildings that are all over the place were really Greco-Roman. They're built by the Greeks or the Romans. I mean, I think that they could have been built by the Romans. It's funny, even Washington, D.C., it used to be called Rome. People don't know that. It's like it's really
DC
curious.
was.
Yeah. The original land was called Rome, right where that's at.
Interesting.
And then you look at the architecture and you're like, okay, so that's kind of convenient that that's what it used to be called. And so I started to see like that it's clearly a different style. And we did a podcast recently. We were talking about like comparing like the old Penn Station and like especially like the inside of it. Like if you see some of the old pictures of the Penn Station, it's like the scale of the columns and the stairs and then the ceiling. And the ceiling had this certain kind of imprint, and it's like these kind of recesses, and it looks a lot like the Pantheon in Rome.
Oh wow!
I think John Levi did a video about that, and I remember like when I first saw that, I'm like, yeah, it does look like the same technology. I mean, whether we built that in a Renaissance style, it's still the same technology. So I mean, it really shouldn't be as hard to believe as people think that if the Romans did that in Rome, then what if they could sail across the sea?
Right.
Or maybe the geography or topography was different back in the day, and maybe some of this is left over. But obviously, that's quite a theory, by me. I know, and I know some people are probably saying, "No way, that's crazy." But I mean, the more I've looked into history, the more I've realized a lot of it's fake, or it just kind of like timelines are just filled in, and I don't think that there's not a lot of as many facts as people believe as we've been taught that there are.
Right.
Go ahead.
We have a quick question that you could probably answer while we go. Are there many of the buildings made of limestone or something else, or granite?
Both.
And where'd they get all that granite?
Yeah, there's a lot of ones. I know that. So I'm really close to like Norfolk, Virginia, and believe it or not, I found this out over the past year too, is that there was a World Fair here. It was called the Jamestown Exhibition. And so Jamestown at least we're taught, was the first permanent settlement here by the British. And so they did something in Norfolk, Virginia. Yeah. And I've gone down there. And so like Norfolk is the closest place to me that you could see kind of like old world looking stuff, like Greco-Roman buildings. And yeah. And some of them were like all granite. And I was just like, there's no way. Like, why would they do this? It's like, what it makes me think is this was a time of excess, right? Because it's like, you don't do this when you're just coming up, right? It's like, but all these cities, I mean, and we're not even just even we're not talking about the biggest cities in America. If you just go around to almost like every old town, there's like some Greco-Roman post office or town hall or something. And you're like, why did they need this?
Exactly.
But, I mean, they didn't, but they sure built them all. And yeah, and it's probably right across the street from a cathedral that's really amazing too. And you're like, even in the little places. And what I've always been kind of struck by is like that a lot of times these timelines are like these things were built in like the 1890s or something. But then there's this really elaborate cathedral here, and you could throw a rock and you could hit another one.
Yeah. We've seen towns like that, or cities where there's like 5 or 6 great big giant churches or cathedrals that you could literally just walk to, or like you said, throw a rock and hit them. Right. I mean, they're that close.
Yeah. And it's like, was there that many different denominations back then? Like when they were building all that stuff? Like it seems odd to me. I mean, I don't know.
And in one little area, how many congregation, or how big is your congregations or your population that can afford to build these great big cathedrals in such a little tiny area?
Well, what I don't get is like Little House on the Prairie and some of these old shows. They look like the whole town went to the same church.
Right. Yeah,
The whole
exactly. Yeah,
community
exactly. Well,
went
that
to
makes
the same
sense.
church, which was the school.
Mm-hmm.
There
That makes
didn't look
sense.
like there was denominations back then.
Yeah, it's funny. Even so my wife and I, we had started watching that Yellowstone show,
Right.
and it's pretty interesting. And of course, I know that they had like a spinoff, and it's called 1883, and it's about them kind of like taking their wagons across the country to get to it. And it's like, like I said again, in the same way that Tombstone's kind of funny when you think that there's these thriving cities not far from wherever they're at, like that in that show, which obviously it does kind of almost reek as propaganda. It's like, this is what it was like then. But meanwhile, they could have stopped in a big city, and they could have been at a World Fair. I mean, it's crazy that sounds, but like that, I think people would just not even be able to compute if that show just said, "Oh, we're going to have this one episode where they go to Chicago and see the World Fair there." It would literally not make sense to them.
Well, who could
Because it
afford
doesn't
to
make
go
sense.
to? Who could afford to go to the World Fair back then? They made it sound like everybody was poor and barely making it. So who could really afford to go and spend a bunch of money and enjoy a World's Fair?
But yet they had millions of visitors. And
Right.
supposedly from overseas, where they came in steamships or whatever and enjoyed the World's Fair. It's like, really?
Yeah. So the funny thing is, a lot of people who defend the narrative and saying that, yeah, they made these temporary fairs. So they built all this infrastructure for like a thing that was only going to last for 6 months. And so they say, oh, it's like the Olympics. Okay, here's why it's not like the Olympics. Is because just think about so everyone, we were just talking about how like LA got the Olympics. It's a big deal when America gets the Olympics because America gets the Olympics. It's not every town in America has an Olympics every year. So you could have a World Fair in St. Louis, and then you have one in Chicago, and then you have one in Omaha, and if you actually probably put them on a timeline, there's lots of them. So it does seem like that if you think about this kind of, more backwards than us, at least we're taught, these people, they would not, I mean, who has the means to go? What are they, just they're on holiday every day? Like they can just go to Chicago. They can continue to go. It's like at some point you think the population could not support that, the travel and the stay to go do this thing, because it would have been more difficult to do back then.
Right.
And, and I think what actually kind of blows it out of the water, somebody actually shared in my comment section today, was that there was a World Fair in Spokane, Washington in 1974. When you get a second, look up that one. You can see, it's pretty obvious. It's not the same kind of style where it's the 1974 one. I totally believe the narrative because it looks like something we would do. They put up like things almost like canopies and tents and things like that. They did not build stone buildings or even plaster and wood is what people tell you. They didn't do anything like that.
Yeah, and it's funny, they say they built that city for the Chicago Fair and other cities out of, like you said, mortar and plaster and wood, and but yet our Chicago Science and Museum was part of the World's Fair, and that is one of the biggest buildings I've ever stepped in, with all those huge almost as magnificent as, I would say, the pyramids in Giza, those big giant blocks, and they glisten in the sun, and it's just amazing. So there's like 4 or 5 structures still left from the Chicago World's Fair, and I don't know if a lot of people still know that or not, but there's still evidence of it in Chicago. But those buildings weren't made out of wood and mortar and going to be tore down right away, or if they did, where's all the rubble from the other buildings if they were made the same way, or why were these buildings made different than the other ones?
No, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth when they say that they were temporary, except for some of them were not temporary. Okay, so again, so even if you were thinking if they built that one building in that short of timeline, that would be hard to believe in itself. So just that one. So then they were building all I think a lot of these World Fairs had up to 200 buildings.
Wow.
Right.
And not only that, and of course, like you see the picture in the background, it's like, then they had all the infrastructure that went along with that, ponds and fountains and statues and walkways and bulkheads and railings, and they had everything. And so the funny part, even for me as a guy who's in my company used to do a lot more plastering we don't do as much now because there's not many people that can do it like they used to. But obviously I do drywall work and I do metal framing, but we work on wood frame buildings too. And so when people say like, oh, they're only built of wood and plaster, and I was just like, what do you think things are built of today? So that doesn't make them temporary. If they tore them down afterwards, I guess you could make a case that they were temporary, but they were built to stand up and last. Because when you see how big that they were, they couldn't just be facades. They were huge. And obviously, even if they were just plaster, those things would weigh a lot.
Yeah.
Like, because back in those days, it's like you said, it's not plaster Paris, it's not paper mache. They would have had to use some kind of cement-based plaster, and it would have had to have some kind of steel to support it. And then when they showed the insides of these buildings, there's massive steel beams and things in them.
Yeah, where's that come from?
You're right. And the funny thing, again, to go back to Penn Station, if you go look in the pictures of the old Penn Station, there's sections of it that look exactly like what you see in the big buildings at the World Fairs. They're the same.
Wow. Yep. I also, the Native Americans, when they got here, I have a page. Well, I don't physically have it, but I got it online where it describes in a 1910 U.S. history book that it says that when they were talking to the indigenous people about their history, they said they came here and these structures and instruments and utensils were already here, and they just repurposed them for their own civilization or living. So that came from the Native Americans that we traveled, and thought they were here forever.
Living in
they ended
teepees.
up telling people, historians, that no, there was a race here before us, and we just took over their stuff, or this stuff was already here. That kind of ties in line what we're talking about, the World's Fair buildings and stuff. Okay, did they really build them? Were some things repurposed?
And if the Indians were smart, do you think they would rather live in teepees or take over these buildings?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is,
of course, the buildings.
Yeah, of course, the truth is like it's kind of interesting when you think about like that these people were either wiped out by our government or they were put in reservations. Kind of makes me almost think about the same way that they had all these insane asylums.
Yeah, they're
where it's like that. It's like, I wonder if the people who were not willing to cooperate with the new thing got cordoned off.
Right.
Like you can't be around the rest of us because you're not going to fit with this narrative. I believe that the natives were multicultural. I don't think it was just one race of people. I think that there's a lot more to this story. I think very obviously, but yeah, I was watching Yellowstone, and I thought it was just so interesting to think like there was one scene where, Kevin Costner's family had lived on this massive ranch, and the guy who was the Indian chief was talking about that his family had came here and built houses on their land. And I just started to think like, it's sort of weird to say that it was your land and you never built anything on it. So like the times people finally started building on it, it was like, you know what I mean? Like if these people were there in that area this whole time and they would not have built anything permanent, because you think just based on the fact that if you believe the history we're taught, a lot of the tribes did not get along. So wouldn't you want something a little more solid if you did potentially have people coming to take your stuff? But like they didn't do that. So why not? I mean, I don't know. It's like I said, isn't it kind of hard to say it's your land if you didn't build a fence, you didn't build a house on the place, you didn't build anything,
The same thing with our military or our cavalry at the time when they went out west. They built forts and they chopped down trees and put these, like Daniel Boone, these great big pillars of trees, and made that their outside perimeter of their little village. It's like, but yet, like you said, you go into the big city and they have these great big cathedrals and stuff. It's like, so our military is using chopped down trees to protect themselves. Why wouldn't they have the structures like the cathedrals were made out of? I mean, you can't burn them down. You can't shoot through them. That doesn't make sense either.
Yeah, if you could build temporary structures like the ones at the World Fair, why wouldn't you just do that?
Right.
You could just build a temporary fort that looks like it's made of stone and has Roman figures on it.
Oh, that's crazy. Well, should we show some pictures?
Sure.
Let me see. Well, I guess let's I'm going to start with the timeline a little bit of Chicago and the World's Fair. I think that would be give me a second and I'll get it up. I should have had it ahead of time, I guess, sitting here.
Well, I was just going to say, like you were saying, they were mentioning the forts were made out of wood and tree stumps, but what's all the star forts? So that's another rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's a good call because there's
Mhm.
star fort. Like again, San Francisco has one. I think they call it Fort. Is it Fort San Francisco or something like that? Gosh, something like that. But yeah, there's
Go
one.
ahead.
There's one like kind of like right under where the Golden Gate Bridge is, and
Hmm.
yeah, it's a star fort, and it's
Yeah.
like
There's star forts
millions
all
of
over.
millions of bricks,
Yeah.
and they were trying to protect that coast from who at that
Beautiful
time.
star forts.
Mm-hmm.
So I like finding these old books. This book happens to be about Chicago from the 1880s, and it does have some pictures in it and things, and which leads us to like, you know, the big Chicago Fair in 1893. But if you go to let me drop that down real quick. Then if you go to the history, 1671 was at the lower end of Lake Michigan, was first mentioned by the Catholic priest or the French priest that came through. Was 1671 for the explorer. Then here you have the John Baptiste actually settled in the area, in the Chicago area, from 1784 to 1788 is that timeline. Then here in 1854, cholera kills 60 residents every summer day in Chicago. So it's like, okay, so the whatever population is there is actually dying out from diseases and all that stuff.
Yeah, 60 a day. That sounds like a lot.
Yeah. Then you got this where the engineering reverses the Chicago, the lake or the river that runs through Chicago because of dysentery and all that. Well, then that October, you know, they have the Great Fire that wipes out most of Chicago, or at least there by Lake Michigan and where the World's Fair is going to be. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff just doesn't make sense. 1803, the Fort Dearborn, and we were just talking about that, where they make forts and it's made out of wood, but yet they have great big giant cathedrals and buildings. I mean, it's just so crazy about this timeline. Then here in 1812, before the war, 15 private homes existed in Chicago.
15.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's then here, 1833, August, the town of Chicago is incorporated. The population totals no more than 200 people.
That, I mean, like, that's crazy.
This is on a website that shows the history of Chicago. So in 1833, there was 200 people in Chicago, but then, you know, the World's Fair, by the time it gets here, there's millions of people. There's a million people in Chicago, and there's millions coming in to watch the World's Fair. So there we went from 200 people to 1893, where they had 27 million people visit the fair.
27 million.
Where did they all stay?
Yes, I was thinking of that too.
Yeah, they would have to build a lot of, not just temporary buildings. They'd have to build a lot of hotels, I guess.
27
I know, it's just.
million.
And
Yeah,
then
I mean, in 6 months, they had 27 million people visit there.
And if they're coming from other countries, that would be so expensive to get over here just for a World's Fair.
Oh, it would be, yeah, it makes no sense.
Mm-mm.
No. I mean, I don't understand how we go, like, their timeline that they give us doesn't make sense.
Well, I think that's exactly what I was saying, is like that it wasn't like my goal was to not believe all the things I was taught. It was just like that I didn't even know, I wasn't even taught these things. You know, it's like, it's kind of like when you hear like stories about how America was built, it's like, of course, I heard the old Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So I was thinking like, okay, so they started building America like in, around 1500, then yeah, fine. I mean, but I had no idea they didn't really start building these cities until like 1850. Like, that's crazy, because it's like, yeah, that's not that long ago, really.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as just like, now that I'm in my 40s, I'm like, okay, so you're really only talking about like a couple generations ago they were doing this. Like, that wasn't that long ago.
Little Twisted says they probably stayed in teepees.
Well, it's funny. So when we did a podcast with Chris from Old World Exploration, and so the title of it was called The United States of Rome. And so at one point we were really kind of spending some time looking at DC. And so DC is kind of funny, because what we're taught in school is that they wanted to build this place not in Virginia and not in Maryland. So they picked this square area to put the capital city in. So neither state would get too powerful. But I was like, but you know what poses a little bit of a problem is the fact that where are people going to live while they're building this city out of nowhere? And you go look it up. They say they lived on farms. They lived in tents. What? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, they were building like castles for the politicians while they were sleeping in tents.
Yeah.
Get out of here with that.
And the details of these castles are just stunning.
And they built things that wow us still today.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, they lasted.
Just like this picture of Chicago from 1820. You have the Indians in their canoes and the water, and you only have a church, or it looks like a church, I don't know, and then you have somebody's house. I mean, so I'm assuming that was the French priest that settled in the area at the time. So there's nothing around except for trees and the water, and then we go here, and this is 1853. So we went from that short of time to this, and we got cathedrals shown in this picture, and obviously the Chicago River, but yet it's still no skyscrapers, no giant buildings. Like, they give us a timeline that they build up this great big giant. Then here's 1830 map of Chicago, where you see all the trees, and you see just a little bit of houses here along the Chicago River and the fort that they talked about. And so it's like, I just don't understand these timelines that they give us, or things that they say it's our real history, but they don't all correlate with each other.
Mm-hmm.
No. Well, that's what happens when you start telling lies. They don't match up with all the other lies.
Then we
it's funny. What's funny to think too. So the area we live in, it's right at sea level. So they don't build any basements, almost none. But the old buildings have basements in them, and so so where I live, Norfolk, Virginia, is like 7 feet above sea level. So they don't. So it floods every time there's a bad storm. But all these old buildings have basements. And I was just kind of thinking in that same timeline where it's like, I wonder what percentage of buildings in downtown Chicago have basements in them. So if you add that on top of the timeline, it's like these people had to excavate, and they had to dig into the ground, make the foundations, and
True. Yeah.
so much more.
So we have another question. There was a picture of a Tartarian flag at the South Pole, along with many more Allied nations, online years ago. You can no longer find it. Have you ever seen it or heard about it? Moon, I hope that's the question you were talking about.
I have not seen that. I think it's funny. So I got this thing behind me, and if you could see up, there's a section where it shows Tartaria on there. And I think it's kind of weird. I kind of think Tartaria is a little bit of a maybe a little bit of a psyop, because they'll try to say that all this stuff was Tartaria, which I believe that Tartaria was real, because obviously it is on old maps and there was a flag and those kind of things. But like, I think when people were first introduced to this topic of like, oh, well, everything's Tartaria, it's just like, but this is everywhere. Right. So I think, but it is a little curious that it's like they really didn't want us to know about that place in Russia. Like, well, they didn't want us to know about that nation. It's really weird. And what was it like is it like the Russian flag was like at one point it was like them stabbing through like the dragon or whatever, the griffin that's on the flag of Tartaria.
Yeah, because a lot of the maps it says Tartaria was pretty much in the Russia area.
Yeah,
so that doesn't explain the buildings over here.
No, I know, I don't think it does, but I do think it's kind of like that kind of fed out there to, as people were learning more, we're like, oh, it's all Tartaria. So then they're following like a different rabbit trail. But I do think the Tartaria stuff is interesting. It's like, that it doesn't look like it's that, whatever that nation was not that long ago.
Right.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe as far out as the Roman Empire traveled, I guess people think that the Tartarian Empire traveled and took control of the area there, but the maps don't necessarily show it coming down into North America, at least the ones I've found. I don't know.
You know, I think, see, this is my research, and I did a video with my buddy Paul from Understanding Conspiracy. And so there's this German researcher named Gunnar Heinzen, and he did his presentation, and it was all about like the stratigraphy from like the first millennium AD was all the same. Like, so all the buildings are built on the same level, the strata. So like you can't find things under, and you don't see anything built on top of it until much later. And so his conclusion, and of course I took it way further than him, but it's like, so all the Roman stuff is built at the same level. And so we're taught about all these other peoples, but all the stuff is built at the same level. So what I think it likely is, I think all this stuff was Rome. I think the stuff that looks like it's Roman was Roman. I'm not saying things weren't built afterwards, but the stuff that fits the architecture today did make sense to me that it was built by the Romans. And so like you could even have Tartary on a map, but the Romans ruled that part of the world too. So they would still name things in the same way. That's why they named London Londinium. So there's still a Roman part of London currently. So they could have been the one section of Rome would have been Tartaria. And so each different part of the empire would have had a slightly different style to it, right? Just because Rome was not just Italians, Rome was something different than, so it's hard for us to maybe conceptualize what that would look like, is that they conquered all the people of the known world. And I don't think that if you can see some of the stuff that the Romans did, or the things that they did, we don't even know how they did. Like I said, whether the topography was different, which I think is certainly possible, they were certainly smart enough to sail across the sea.
Right.
Because they were smarter than the Europeans that sailed across the sea. I mean, so I do think that's really maybe like the real hidden in plain sight stuff, is that all these Western countries are so enamored with Rome, because I think that it's kind of like, because they've been trying to bring Rome back.
You know, the other thing is, and I brought it up on other shows and we've talked about it. I think we've done a show about it with Jessica, the Cryptid Huntress, on her channel about the Grand Canyon in Egypt.
Okay.
And then here in Illinois, where Cahokia Mounds is, that section of southern Illinois has been known as Little Egypt. And so you got the mound builders, one of the biggest mounds, square footage wide for the U.S. anyway. I don't know about worldwide, but it's the biggest structure as far as square footage. Mound building shaped almost like a pyramid, and the whole area is called Little Egypt.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we went out to the Grand Canyon last year, and yeah, if you've ever been, it's like, it really is kind of take your breath away, but it just seems like there's something about this place. I mean, obviously all the rock formations that are literally named the Temple of Isis, the Temple of Shiva,
right,
the Tower of Ra, and yeah, it's like they do look like temples, don't they? I mean, that's one of the things that kind of got me. That's kind of one of my other favorite topics is like, meltology, if you will. Like we've gone out west recently and going to these places. Like a good example is like Sedona, and it's got those red parts of those mountains, and like you just couldn't tell me that those things weren't something else because it looks like something that was melted.
Yeah.
Yep.
A lot of old buildings.
So I think something really, really bad happened out that part of the country, because it's like that's why there's so much desert, and there's obviously some really nice areas out there, but there's long stretches where it's just like desolate.
Yeah. Yeah, you see so many pictures of these structures being built into the mountains, way back in the day. Well, it actually looks like the mountain was melted over whatever was there.
Mm-hmm.
And that explains all the bricks that you can't even put a piece of paper in between some of these bricks in these old buildings in these other countries. It looked like it was melted.
Yeah, one of the best examples around the world is Cappadocia, Turkey. And when you see that place, it's just like there's just no way that wasn't a melted place. It just
right.
Like the idea that people carved those holes into those mountains and caves and stuff. It's like, no, those things they look like buildings. It literally looks like something like ice cream melted, the way the things are shaped.
So they're trying to explain that they carved a city inside the mountain. Really? Back then?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Doesn't fit the narrative. Just like the cathedrals and all that we were talking about. It's like, really, with the tools they had, the technology that we're told they had, how is that possible?
Well, they told us it was medieval times, but it looks like they lived in luxury back then.
Right. Yeah. The Dark Ages, obviously, they were doing something right. I can't explain it. I mean, but I always think America's good. I think just because you can point to European things and you say, look, well, Europe has a really old history. So like it's harder to say, and obviously there's many examples of buildings like that. I think it's in America where it doesn't make sense. And if you think about like the timeline of America is them, the Revolution and the 1770s, and then they don't even establish DC as the capital until like 1790. And then there's a war with the British again in 1812. There's like a Spanish American War. There's a French Indian War. And so what makes sense to me is that if you were building these buildings, it looks like a time of peace and prosperity. But there was neither during those times. And then eventually there's a civil war right in the middle of all of it.
Right.
Even it's funny just thinking like the timeline of them building DC. So we're taught is that Richmond was the capital of the South, and like not very far from DC, and literally they're still building the capital city right there in this time where they're fighting in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania and stuff. It's like it seems crazy because it just like I said, it seems like that wouldn't a lot of resources be involved in that. And yeah, and at the same time you're saying like that the people are also expanding westward and they're building these cities. What about the war that's happening between the North and the South?
Right.
Why are these people not involved in that?
That's a good point.
But let alone we're supposed to believe all this that we're told.
And the Civil Wars also might be a bit convenient to explain how all these places got burned down in the South, because the North, who was trying to keep the South in the Union, was sending their generals into burned cities down in the South. Were they just trying to roll over the ashes?
Right.
I still can't believe those buildings back then.
So this is from the World's Fair in Chicago. But when I first saw these pictures, I thought for sure this was like in Rome or somewhere else. I mean,
right.
Italy. It's like, oh my gosh. And then I tried to get as high a definition pictures as I could, and it's just like, look at the structures.
Can't
One thing I always say is
like that now.
They don't look brand new.
Right.
To me, they don't.
Yeah, they do.
I mean, obviously it's hard to see, but I don't think they look brand new.
Yeah, because it looks like there's a little bit of like flooding and stuff that could have happened on these bridge.
You know how long it would take to just build that bridge? today.
Yeah. And they claim they built all this in a short period of time.
Yeah, look how wide it is for the supposedly just for people to walk across.
Yeah, it's unreal. And when I was talking with Chris, I was saying, like, isn't it kind of funny too that we were showing in DC the Library of Congress, and so isn't it kind of funny to think that they were building Renaissance style buildings like Roman things in these world fairs. Meanwhile, before that, they were building real ones in Washington D.C. So why are they building temporary buildings when they're actually capable of building the real ones like they did in DC?
Right.
Yeah.
And they built that one, which is not temporary.
Exactly.
Just the
So this is
carvings
off of
alone.
the main lake from the World's Fair, you know, and you can see the building, and this is still in existence. You know, it's a museum in Chicago now. And it's like, you look at the structure.
That's stunning. And
I
they
mean,
carved
not
all
only
that
do you
out.
have this great ornate on the outside, but the inside's exactly like it too. And look at the pillars. I mean,
Yeah, and it doesn't even do it justice unless you have a person next to them just to see how big they are. What's also a little suspect to me is I always think too, so if this was built like in a, if all the buildings were built temporary, including this one, I almost bet you anything that building's got a basement in. I bet you it goes deep too. I bet you it goes probably a couple floors down.
yeah.
Because if you look at it, and a lot of the buildings we talk about is that, why do they all have stairs up to the front door?
Exactly.
Lots of stairs.
We talk about that about churches and stuff. Why do you go up 2 stories or more to get into the front door?
And then a lot of times to go down.
That's the first level.
To go downstairs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. That's why I said
giant doors.
Interesting in that presentation we were talking about was that, like, so the strata, I think the strata is the thing that does not lie. Because if these buildings were built later than some of the other ones, then they would have been built at a higher level. You know what I'm saying? Like, especially if they were temporary, there's no way they would have dug into the ground to build these things. They would have built them straight on the ground.
Right.
But if these things are built at the same level as earlier buildings, where there is a layer below, basements that are really not basements, I think that's proof that these things were here before.
And the buildings that are built downhill, why would you build a building on a hill and make it level looking, but the building's going down?
Mm-hmm.
We have those pictures too.
Beautiful buildings.
So that's the actual gateway, or they called it the gateway to Woodland, where they had a little pond and some trees and some animals and stuff. So that still exists in Chicago. And I don't think a lot of people realize it when they go through that entrance, as it was part of the World's Fair.
Mm-hmm. It's held up pretty well for being temporary.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's just the main ticket area where you go into the World's Fair, and look how ornate that is. I mean,
why would you build a ticket booth like that?
But you also got there, it looks like there's a bunch of light bulbs on there, isn't there?
It is. It's that's another thing about this World's Fair. It all had electricity, and everything was lit up.
Can you imagine how much wiring it would have took to light everything up? How many light bulbs it would have taken at a time where they did not produce light bulbs in any kind of, like, you know, assembly line way. Like, you couldn't just go buy light bulbs. They were new.
Right. Yeah, literally. Then here's the famous Ferris wheel.
That's crazy how big that they were.
Yes, that thing's massive.
Yeah, they got like gondolas on them. They're not like the ones that you see like at an amusement park. They're huge.
That is
it's like a train car
on
a Ferris wheel. It's just like crazy.
And they had technology to build all this.
It's also interesting.
Figure out how it worked.
I'm always a little bit struck on just like how people dressed back in those days too. It's like, it just seems like people look out of place in these things. It's just like
they all look like they're rich and well off.
Right. Yeah. They're like aristocrats.
Yes. But we were told everybody's all poor and out in the desert, living in log cabins.
Yeah, I can't imagine somebody in a work shirt and boots or a bib overhaul showing up at the World's Fair.
No, they didn't do that, did they?
So there's a night picture, and everything is lit up.
Unbelievable. We don't make buildings anymore with domes.
Then once again, here we have what I would consider Roman. I mean, that looks like a Roman Caesar or a.
What is that? Is he holding? Is that the god Nike?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's I just don't understand it. Just that, like you said, none of it makes sense. To build this and right after the fire, the Great Fire in Chicago, and then what, 30 years or whatever after, then we have this.
Wow.
Yeah, there's just no way that's temporary. Look at all that. Look at all that water.
Right.
And that landscape does not look like that anymore.
Right. Yeah, you go down Lakeshore Drive and you walk along Lake Michigan, and it's just like, other than the buildings that are the museums, the life and science and the history buildings, and but I mean, you have to have big blocks of cement or concrete to be able to hold that water. You have to have something. I mean, I know the Romans did, but
and if that's carved, that's amazing carving. It just looks like technology these days. You put it in a computer and it lasers it out. Oh, well, they didn't have anything like that back then. You make a mistake on that carving, you're messed up. There's no mistakes on these.
That kind of reminds me of the step dome that you were talking about, but this is the gateway into that.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, here's another one that comes along with it. The orphan trains. What happened to all the parents?
I think that those are the people in the insane asylums.
Yep, because they were speaking the truth.
Yeah, I actually brought that up on a show. I think it was Jessica or maybe it was just our show, that once people, even people that have abilities, whether you call yourself a medium or channeler and people like that, I think they got sent to asylum so they didn't have to deal with them because they were speaking out and telling things that they didn't want people to know. And then I think, like you said, that the parents that wouldn't go along with the system or the agenda that they were putting out, so then the children were left, and then that's the ones that they can train and control and teach them the history they want them to know.
Reset.
Yeah, there was definitely a reset. That's yeah, I think that it makes sense to me, because if you think I think they say between 1856 or 1866 and like 1920 something, there was 250,000 orphans on those trains. And then at the same time, I think in like around 1900, there was 150,000 people in insane asylums.
Wow.
And so what a lot of people got locked up for back in those days was religious fanaticism. And I was talking with my buddies. I said, you know what? That really doesn't make a lot of sense either, because the First Amendment, right? Like, how are you going to lock somebody up for religious fanaticism in a country that was supposed to be founded about religious freedom?
That's true.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, true.
You would have thought those people would have been a little bit more about their rights, because obviously you think like strong, resilient people who do all this stuff, they're just going to be willingly go get locked into nut houses that are actually not houses, they're castles.
Yeah,
that's a crazy one there.
There's this, so like you said, there is, and here's a picture of the indoor.
Yeah,
of all the seatings and the levels that they have, and once again the pillars. this amazing architecture for the short amount of time that they had. And like you said earlier, which ones were temporary and which ones weren't.
And it had to cost a lot of money to build these.
Yeah, who's paying for all that?
Yes. Yeah, who's paying for all that? They have to pay for the workers too, let alone the material.
Yeah, this is supposed to be before they had the Fed, right? Where they couldn't just print money.
Right.
Wow. And I don't think this because they lost the gift or the skill to build anything like this.
There's a better picture
Oh
of the
my
Ferris wheel.
gosh.
Yes, that thing is absolutely massive.
Can you imagine being up on top? Wow.
Supposedly that was up for a few years, and then they tore it down and moved it to another World's Fair.
Gosh.
And put it on display. And then after that fair, they tore it down and just scrapped it.
Oh my gosh.
But you can see the people inside this.
Oh wow. Now was that glass?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. It would be hard to imagine seeing that in person, how big that is.
Wow.
It'd be interesting to have a picture from their point of view up in there. What's the landscape past the expo look like?
Oh yeah.
So there's a bigger picture of the going off of Lake Michigan, and then the back side of the building.
It's a lot of pictures with not lots of people in them.
No.
I thought there was 27 million there. You think it would have been pretty jam-packed in that place.
So that's another point. How soon was this built? And then how long before they actually started letting people in? So were some of these pictures before the crowds got there? Then if so, how, you were pressed for time to build all this, but then yet you have pictures where there's hardly nobody ever there.
I think I remember researching this a little bit. I think I heard that. So there was a centennial celebration in Philadelphia in 1876. And they built the biggest building in the whole world. And I think it was like maybe 20 acres big on the inside.
Wow.
But in Chicago, they built one that was 40 acres. So they built the biggest building in the whole world and then tore it down afterwards.
That is crazy.
I believe they tore it down, but I don't believe they built it.
No, I don't think they built it either. And maybe that's the case too. Maybe the ones that are still existing are the ones that were there before, and they're really good built buildings, and then the ones that they built were the crappy ones that they tore down because they weren't the same kind of quality. I mean, I don't know.
This is my thought, and I could change my mind about this, but I think that they could not explain away this much, so they did leave some. And it's like typically they co-opted those buildings to be courthouses, post offices,
libraries.
Yeah, something like that, museums and things like that. But the narrative could not stand, like, if these cities like Omaha, St. Louis, Chicago, San Francisco, all the West Coast cities and things like that, if they all look like this, I don't think anyone would believe anything if all that was stone that was left over. So that's why they had to get rid of the great majority of it, because they could explain a little bit away, but they could not explain that. They could not explain that.
How can you explain building a statue that big back then?
Yeah, that statue is ridiculously big,
Yes.
isn't it? Because you see how big those buildings are.
Can you imagine trying to stand that up if it's laying down?
I think they have
placing it up there and
in one of the parks in Chicago, I think they have a replica that's obviously not that big, but they have a replica of what it looked like.
wow.
Yeah, it's like, I know it's probably not as big as the Statue of Liberty, but it's like, compared to those buildings, that thing is pretty
Mhm.
big. Looks like it.
It does look like that.
It'd be fun to take that across the water and place it up there.
And if it's a Midwestern World's Fair, why would you have something that looks like a Greek goddess or a Roman statue that had to? Or why is that so important to the overall theme of the fair?
Or was it the theme that year? Or did they have themes?
Oh, it's Columbia. It's supposed to be about Christopher Columbus discovering America. So what's that have to do with this guy?
Right.
A guy from Portugal that sailed for the Spanish.
Yeah.
No, I mean but that's the thing. Is like most of the world fairs look very Roman. It's like, why did they build them all the same theme?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it wasn't a theme. It was what was here.
That's I mean, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Why didn't they do like a medieval theme and like make it all like
right
King Arthur and just make castles and stuff? They obviously could make castles. They're all over the place.
I just think it's funny they use words that you didn't even think about, but now you look and go, oh, it says it was founded in the 1800s, not built. They all say founded.
Then I think we've talked about it before. When you get these large cathedrals and all these giant buildings, why do they have these doors?
Yes.
Yeah. That's still one that's stumping me a little bit because, one of the things I've really focused on over the years was like Genesis 6 and the Nephilim and giants biblically. And
yes.
And I've read, obviously you talk a lot about the book of Enoch, and I definitely believe in giants. Giants were real. Now, how long ago were giants here?
Probably not too long ago with these.
Yeah,
buildings.
I don't think it was that long, but
right.
But it's sort of weird in the timeline because even like so you read in the New Testament, obviously it's the times of Rome. They never talk about giants
right
in the New Testaments, but it does seem like that. You don't build. Why would you build a door that big? Like especially when you see like some of them like the door where the door handle is.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like a way above her head. Right.
Yeah.
Here.
Sometimes they're almost like midway through the door.
Yeah, they're up here really, sometimes. I think I have really a picture of one that has a way up there.
Yeah, the door. That's one that really is like still trips me out.
And beautiful doors. Once again, all the details in it.
Yeah, there's a ridiculous.
Oh my gosh. Look at the details in that. Oh wow.
Now I didn't mean to go that far, but we'll talk about that anyway. But I did a show not too long ago where we talked about the Aztecs and the Olmecs down in South America and how they traveled up into the United States, North America. And one of the subjects was the young boy that was 7 years old came over and lived in South America with the Aztecs, and he eventually wrote their history. They trusted him and started divulging and telling their oral history and stuff. And according to them, the giants were chased out or killed, but some of them traveled up into the Mississippi Valley and into maybe Cahokia and places like that. And it says that they were the mound builders. They're the ones that made these cathedrals and temples because they were big enough to lift the blocks. And that's in that book from 1500s, I believe, was when that was written.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've done a little bit of research about like the Aztecs, and I remember that in their history, they believe they were one of 7 sacred tribes, and those sacred tribes came from inside the earth.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah, it's wild. So when they came up to the surface of the earth, there was giants, and the giants are the ones who built like the pyramids in Mexico. And so there was a really interesting story. I think that Graham Hancock has that show on Netflix called Ancient Apocalypse. And so there's a place in Mexico called Cholula, and it's actually the biggest pyramid in the whole world as far as like the perimeter of it. It's not as tall as Giza, but if you didn't know, it looks like a giant hill, and there's a Catholic church on the top of it. And so what the Aztecs told the Spanish was that, giants built this place, and then the sky god was angry with them, and he sent a flood to kill them. And you're just like, where would they get that story from? Because obviously they would have no idea about the Bible.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's because that story is true everywhere. It's like that story is all around the whole world.
Yeah, there's a flood narrative in every civilization or every almost every Bible, I think, as far as it's not always Noah, it's whatever they're like, whether it's Muhammad or whoever they put in their Bible.
Yeah, it's history. I think that obviously that was the first big reset, and I believe that there was another reset probably around 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, who knows how many resets there's been.
Yeah, I think that there definitely could be regional resets more than we know, but what was really interesting, again, I keep on going back to that one lecture by Gunnar Heinsohn, that he was showing like the sedimentary layers, and like the scientists basically talk about one that was 10,000 BC, and he was saying like, I don't really agree with those dates, but just for lack of news, for not arguing, they all believe it was the deluge. So there was this one sedimentary layer, and then there was another one after that. And I think that was whatever people called the mud flood, because he actually showed illustrations from Rome where from like the 15 and 1600s, where they were farming in the city of Rome. They were farming in London. Like that's how much sediment and dirt were there, because they obviously had not dug it out. Right. And I think that's why there's these layers of these things. And then that's why like cities were built on top of other cities, because that was the layer of the strata where there was a civilization, and now that civilization was buried and it's been uncovered. And I think it does make sense that these cities were founded in a certain time. And you can imagine what an undertaking it would have been just to dig these places out, because there's evidence that it was. Like Kansas City is a good example, where if you see pictures of Kansas City, there's just like, it's unbelievable. Like when you see like these buildings and there's mounds of dirt as big as the buildings right next to them.
Yeah.
It looks like they just had dug that place out.
And some they didn't dig, they just built on top. It was easier.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the same way I was telling that story about Cholula, is the Spanish built a church on top of this old pyramid, but the pyramid was completely under the ground. You know, it kind of reminds me, did you guys ever see that movie From Dusk Till Dawn?
Yes.
You know, the end of the movie is classic, where they went to some kind of biker bar. At least that's what they thought it was. And obviously it's filled with vampires or whatever. And when they pan backwards, you can see it was literally just the top of a pyramid. It was this massive step pyramid. I'm like, dang, that is one of those things where it's like they're telling you. That's what they're showing you right in this movie. I mean, that's unreal right there.
Yeah, that's one of the best pictures. Yeah, I've got so many pictures of things like this that you just see cities underneath buildings.
Yeah, that's just unreal.
And it's not even the same, like we talked about before. It's not even the same architecture. I mean, you have the columns. You have the columns down here.
Yeah, you can tell it's a different era.
So if you built this to support that, you would not have put these columns the way they are there. I mean, you can tell me, as being in construction, I mean, you wouldn't have columns supporting a big structure like that, I wouldn't think, as your base.
No, I think in general, like columns, like the way those look, they look more like, for aesthetic, the way that they look like they're built.
Facade somewhere, then somebody built on top of that existing building.
There's probably more underneath that if they kept digging.
Yeah, if you even look at where the backhoe is at the bottom, like there's like how much further down does it go?
Yes.
Yeah.
And like you said,
that's a lot of earth right there underneath that old building. And then you got the present day world. I'm assuming present day world that's on top of all that.
Still more impressive than the stuff we built that's built on top of it.
Then
And
this
anything
doesn't
you
really
use.
have to do with that, but this is the White House, or it's either the White House or Capitol building. I can't. I think it's the White House.
Yeah, it looks like the White House.
Yeah,
Where they
there's two
have all
pictures
these
of that.
multiple layers in front over what should be like a driveway and a step going up to the White House, and you have the building windows down here.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm like I said, I'm about 3 hours from DC, so I've been up there quite a few times, and yeah, all the buildings are like under the ground, all of them.
Wow.
And it's just like I said, it really makes no sense. Actually, the funny thing is, like, the White House is an impressive building, but not in DC. It's not next to all the other ones.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it doesn't even, it pales in comparison. And obviously, if people have never visited there, obviously there's the Capitol building, there's the Supreme Court building, there's the Library of Congress, but then there's like the Treasury building and other kind of like I guess what is like the can't even think of all the names. These buildings take up blocks, and there's columns as far as the eye can see.
Wow.
That are like 20, 30 feet tall. And it's just like, and you're thinking like they built this for a government that was supposed to be really limited at that time. And what they say right now is, I think they say Washington, D.C. has like, the government spends over like, I don't know how many billions of dollars a year for empty space. Because as big as the government is now, they still can't even fill all those buildings. The old ones.
Yeah, and I really like this picture because it shows from all over the world buildings that just like what we've been talking about. It's like, okay.
Beautiful details.
So all over the whole world, at the same time period, we have all these buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And just like we were talking about, we were in horse and buggy, and then you go over like the Middle East, they didn't even have horse and buggy. They had camels and whatever. And you go over to India, and it's like, how do you explain this? Or in the middle of, or Russia even, when you have the horrible weather almost all year round there sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a good one right there is Melbourne, because as weird as the American timeline is, the Australian one is even worse, because we're just told that was some kind of prisoner settlement. And yeah, right. Melbourne has got tons of these buildings too. It's like, yeah, it does not fit. And yeah, like what we're taught is that like the Far East would not have had a lot of contact with these people, especially to have the exact same buildings. It makes no sense. I think there's a really good one where I think it's some kind of like a wall with like kind of a tower. And I think it's in Germany. And there's like one that's identical in Japan, which,
wow,
again, that does not fit.
Well, just think of all the marble and the granite they're using for a lot of these. I mean, that's heavy right there. And where did they get it in that mass amount? I mean, all these cathedrals are they're stunning on the outside, but you go on the inside and you can't fathom how they even attempted to build them.
And think about all the copper for the roofs and things like that.
Where'd they come up with all this material?
Mm-hmm. And then the landscaping, besides the necessarily building the building, but to keep up the landscaping and the statuary and the bushes and the flowers. And
you know what you see in a lot of these pictures, though? You see a lot of really small, like shrubs and not many tall trees or anything like that around that, where like it seems like
they're regrown.
Yeah, it seems like something happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that like some of if you ever have gone down the rabbit hole of like the Capitol buildings around the United States, and again, I won't go back to Yellowstone, because they always show the state Capitol building in Montana. And if you ever look at like the pictures of like when it was supposedly brand new, there's like a guy and his donkey or horse, and there's like a little wooden shack next to it, and it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere. It looks like there's nothing around it. It's really, those pictures are always really eerie, because it does look like they just came upon this building and it was just there
and founded it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just mind baffling to think of all this. Like, and like you said, I don't know if we'll ever know the truth until we go to the other side, or I know they're not going to tell us.
It feels like we're getting a little closer though, because it seems like I don't know how long like the earliest people who've been doing this research have been doing it, but it does seem like that. I feel like I've learned a lot in a year, and obviously with the combined research of all the people looking into it, I feel like we're getting closer. But yeah, like there's certainly some people that know. I mean, I believe that's what the secret society stuff is all about. It's like that's some of the hidden knowledge. Bet you if you could go in that library in the Vatican, the secret that's got 53 miles worth of bookshelves, I bet you might find a little bit about what happened. But yeah, like they're not going to willingly tell us this stuff.
Then I kind of wonder, you know, under the Sphinx is supposed to be that the hallway or the library is supposed to have the Alexandria scrolls and stuff. I mean, you know, I don't know if it's true or not, but I mean, it makes me wonder. It's like all this stuff we talk about and discover. It's like, well, it really wouldn't surprise me if they did say all of a sudden we have the Alexandria scrolls.
I think it's more like Raiders of the Lost Ark when they find the Ark at the end and they just stick it in that gigantic warehouse that like looks like 1 million square feet. To me, it's like I never realized how much of a real movie that could have been, was that, because obviously if they ever found something like that, they absolutely would never tell anyone. And it's like people would say, like, what if they did find something that didn't quite fit the timeline in one of the pyramids in Egypt? They would never tell us. Right. They would hide that thing. So I think that I do believe that there's still a lot of things to be discovered, but I think that those people are the ones doing the discovering. And I think that the majority of the stuff that probably could be discovered is under the ground.
Just like the other movie I really love is National Treasure, where they finally go in there and kind of like what you said, they had the torches and they light up just that little section. And they think, oh man, how marvelous this is. And look at all the treasure. Then they finally light up the rest of the room. It's like, oh my gosh, all the wonders that are there.
These buildings are just, they're so big. I mean, that's the thing. It's like all the scale of it and just the size of them, the insides of them, they're just the ceilings. It just seems like, you know, it doesn't seem crazy too if you think about like a place like Chicago that gets very cold. Like you would have a building that like would just be so massive. You know, you can imagine like how cold that place would be in the wintertime.
Right. I mean, I understand the thickness of the walls. That would be important in that kind of climate. But once you start going up, then you start losing all your heat value.
Yeah, it would be freezing in one of those places.
Well, back then, heat was by fireplace.
And then they have all those fireplaces that don't have any burn marks in them and things like that. Like really, that's another rabbit hole about how they did heat some of these places. They obviously did. I mean, it's funny to think about like even like the narrative that, and they showed like kind of like just like medieval times, they had like the peasants like basically had this gigantic fireplace in their little houses. And then the lords and the dukes and the kings and these people lived in these massive castles. There would be no possible way to heat it.
Right. Yeah, no matter how big that fireplace is, it's not going to heat that tall ceiling in that large room.
No, but so I mean, to me, it makes it seem like these people weren't being cold all the time. There was another way. Again, I think that's the thing I've learned more than anything, is that kind of like the evidence of an advanced civilization is typically their buildings. Yeah. And that's why, like, if you go all the way back to the pyramids and like the weird stuff in Peru, South America, all, you know, like all the megalithic stuff.
Yeah.
You know, if you ever looked into that, like what we're told is these people cut stone with tools that's softer than the stones are. So obviously that immediately you just know that can't be true. So what do they build it with? We don't know. We really, if we're being honest, we really don't know how they did it. And if anybody who's actually wants to, you know, if you're actually into science and things like that, you could say that we just don't know. There's certain mysteries. So to me, it's like that's proof of an advanced, like connected civilization, as you have pyramids on almost every continent, and we really don't know how they did the things they did. And I think going forward, all the stuff you were just showing, that's the same. I got the same case there where you have evidence of a very advanced civilization that's clearly connected. And how do I know? Because they built the same buildings.
Right.
And so how did they do it? I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah, going back to the fireplaces, a lot of these mansions have these huge fireplaces that you can walk into. Well, it looks like a giant fireplace, not a small, normal person. It looks like a giant lived in that place. And of course, that's why the fireplace was just huge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the other thing, then you go down the rabbit hole where they use the ether to heat or cool your house, where they had the spheres and the towers, the steeples on top of the buildings that had the liquid mercury, and they're able to combine that with taking energy from the ether, and it flows out through the fireplace. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know the science behind it necessarily, but you find that rabbit hole every once in a while.
Yeah, I'm one of the people who believe. I do believe that there was practical uses for there was practical reasons why they built things the way they did. I think that all the antiquitech, the antennas, the domes, the materials they use, there's lots of evidence those things are strong conduits for electricity. So to me, it makes sense that they did that, because it is funny, like when you see some of the cathedrals and they have all that copper and just like the points and just like the excess of things on there. Mm-hmm. They do look like electrical, devices. Right. So, I mean, I think that, and it makes sense. It makes sense that those people, whoever did that, were advanced. And then you go down the rabbit hole of like the bells and the frequencies and the sounds. I think that that's probably the kind of the missing component on how they did some of the things they did, because like you were saying, like how could they replicate those certain patterns? Right. Well, sound can make shapes, the cymatic pattern. So I think that's the missing component, because that's the kind of technology we really don't have. And that's why we can't understand how they did it. I think because they had something else.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time, but I'll share one more picture, and maybe if you come back some other time, we can start going down that rabbit hole of frequencies and why things were built in cathedrals the way they were, like the stained glasses for the color frequencies. And then you have the music frequency with the big pipe organs for the healing of not only your mind, but your body and soul. Yeah,
I think, well, I would say that when I went to DC and we visited the Library of Congress, so like where you go, like the reading area. Well, I mean, for one, I said, every time I've gone to these places, I think they all look like temples, like all these old buildings. Because again, if you I remember when you're turning a page in this library and you can just hear the sound bounce all around this place. It's like, it's not the kind of place you wouldn't build a library if you want it to be quiet like that. So I do think that, I think that's the reason why that these places likely were so big, is because they had bells, they had organs, they had different ways. I mean, it was about the sound. It was about the frequencies and the vibrations. And obviously, those pipe organs are unreal.
Right.
And I think they had something besides just aesthetics and things like that. I do believe they likely had something to do with making people feel a certain way.
Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Healing.
Well, like I said, if you're willing to come back, we can go down that route with the cathedrals and the sound frequencies and healing vibrations. And
yeah, sure, we can do it sometime. That'd be great.
Nice.
Awesome.
Well, we'll just go ahead and say goodbye to you, because I think you said you have another appointment or something to do.
Yeah, I got to bounce off here in a second. But yeah, I appreciate you guys having me on. This was a fun conversation.
Yeah,
thank you for joining us.
It very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, God bless y'all.
All right,
thank you. Bless. Bye. Thank you so much. Wow.
So I hope you guys all enjoyed this conversation, and I know you guys have been going right along with us with all the stuff that we've been talking about, and especially when we start talking about the cathedrals and the giant houses and the doorways. You guys were really right on point with us.
And I did put the link in chat for JT's channel. So you can go
And I
check them
think a
out.
couple other people have shared it also throughout the chat. And JT is just a fantastic guy. And if you get a chance, go watch his videos because he digs into all this and makes really good shorts. And he also has podcasts that they do and talk about this stuff all the time and other subjects. So make sure you go visit that.
Yeah, so go subscribe to him. And you can also go to John Levy, which is JonLevi. John Levy talks about old world buildings, Tartaria. My lunch break is another one. And I highly recommend watching their last video, which is, I think, a day or two ago. Maybe it was just yesterday, about a map. So my lunch break, that last video they uploaded, I was just amazed. I watched the whole thing last night.
Yeah.
Like 44 minutes long. So those are some other channels that they dig deep into these buildings and try to explain some of it. So those are a couple other channels you can check out.
So that map, go watch that one.
Yeah, my lunch break.
And then if you get a chance, go to the Cryptus Huntress and watch the show that we did with her about that exact same map like 8 months ago. I can't remember.
About exactly. A year ago, somewhere
about a year ago,
there.
we did that exact same map, but we talked about the continents and the
blemmies and
the blemmies and all the stuff, the dragons and all that stuff that was on there, possibly Bigfoots. So then go check out Jessica Cryptus Huntress show that we were on it.
She's still getting comments on some of those shows and maps and
land
past the ice wall. Yeah, the maps is another very good rabbit hole to go down.
I actually have a few more maps that we haven't even talked about that I found to have the same similar kind of things, a couple of different things on it, but some of the creatures and the different topography that's on it. So having said that, everybody, we're so glad that you joined us today, and we love you very much. And we're going to go ahead and get out of here since our guest had to take off because we scheduled him according to what time he was able to come on our show.
And we got to go to Jessica Cryptid Hunters. Jessica's on right now, isn't she?
That's right.
So we need to swap right over to Jessica.
We need to all go over to Jessica and watch her show because I know we'll be in chat. So
we're late.
So we love you all. We'll see you next time. Don't forget to come back Sunday.
Yep, Sunday night.
Central. That's our normal time and our normal day. So we will have a great guest for you then. And come and hang out with us on Sunday. Love you all.
Keep your vibrations high and stay away from fear. Yeah, stay away from fear.
Keep looking up. We'll see you next time.
Love you.